I don't know about you, but as an academician and a scientist, one of the things we struggle with is thinking about how do we make our work relevant? How do we continue to disseminate in a broad way? And Dr. Bowles is an exemplar of doing that. And I think each one of our panelists today have an example of how you navigate complex systems and bring sometimes research ideas or clinical ideas to a broad mass of individuals. Our next presenter is Dr. Stephen Fening. Dr. Fening is the director of the Case Coulter Translational Research Partnership, and I won't steal his thunder because I think he's going to explain a little bit more about the Case Coulter Partnership, some of the resources that are available to many of us in the room today. He's also the co-founder and chief technology officer of Apto Orthopedics Corporations, and he's going to talk about his work in the field of orthopedics and bringing a product to market. So Dr. Fening.
Great, thank you. Hey, Shanina, how are you? Good morning, everybody. So I want to just jump right in with the video that I have. Hopefully it will play and we can hear it.
It's like so close. There you go. We're not right over it.
So this, by the way, is a woman who was born deaf, just received this cochlear implant, and is about to hear for the first time.
Oh, that's exciting. Here, you can put it down for a second. Just get used to the sound. What does it sound like? Do you want to grab some tissue? Oh, I want to hear myself cry. Can you hear me? Can you hear your voice? Does your voice sound pretty loud? No, not really. Well, that's good. My laughter sounds loud. Yeah, you'll get used to all of that over time. Do you want to hear your husband say something?
So I love showing this video when I do talks like this because it's usually a pretty strong emotional response and helps remind us why many of us got into the field of biomedical research in the first place, which was to make an impact on people's lives, on patients' lives. One of the things, as I started my career, I started as a scientist in orthopedic research, which I'm not going to talk about too much today, but it was a little bit surprising to me what the time span and what needed to happen from research to actually making a clinical impact. And I think one of the necessary pieces is the commercialization of different technologies. And for a technology to be commercialized, where it would ultimately make a patient impact, it needs to have a business proposition because most companies aren't willing to take a loss on a product to sell them. So we're going to talk about some of the elements today that are needed for translation. One of the questions that I'm often asked about is where key, particularly medical innovations come from. I'm not going to go through all the details of this study, but this was looking at exactly that question. What is the source of really the game-changing key innovations? And as you can see by the data, the red colors are more from academic sources, blue colors being more from typical industry, R&D labs. You can see that there's a huge trend towards the game-changing innovations coming from academia. So that's a good sign. But on the other side of that, we have a lot of room for improvement. So if you consider two numbers, first 800,000 and the second 87, 800,000 is the number of, or specifically 806,326 is the number of medical research papers that were published in 2015. 87 is the number for that same year of the number of new drugs and devices combined that were approved by the FDA. So that's like a trickle coming out of a fire hose, and that's not a great thing. There's a lot of room for improvement there. And this has been penned, this span between research and clinical impact has been penned by many as the valley of death. There's this kind of famous pictorial by Nature in 2008 that described this. Again, on one side you have research, on the other side you have the clinical impact, and unfortunately this valley seems to be getting wider and wider and wider. Medical technologies require a lot of help, a lot of money, a lot of time to get across this valley. In most cases, it needs to be a joint effort really between academia and industry. The way that I tend to look at it is a little bit of a bridge that looks something like this, where we have translational research, which to me is kind of the academic side of this, is where we're trying to take, and I'll explain this a little bit more, take our technologies to a point at which industry would be willing to lay down the other side of the bridge, take the risk on the technology, and take it all the way to commercialization where it can have that patient impact. So what I'm going to talk about today are what I call a top 10 elements for translation. I'm going to talk a little bit about how that can be integrated into the most basic research programs. And then I'll talk a little bit about translational research infrastructure that's here at CASE. So top 10 elements for translation. Number one, this is probably the most important, is unmet need. Commercialization of a product is not about your technology or your product. It's about solving a need. It's usually a need of a patient or a provider in our situation. In order to truly understand an unmet need, you need to understand who your customer is, not just an idea of, and just I'll take a second here, it might seem obvious, it might seem to you as healthcare providers that you are the customer for technologies. Sometimes that is the case. Sometimes more and more it's becoming the actual patient that's the customer of the technology. Sometimes it's a hospital system, sometimes it's an insurance company. So understanding who your customer is, you need to understand what the competition is and what providers are currently using. So that's the current gold standard. And then what the strengths and weaknesses of all those different options are. This has nothing to do at all with your product or your idea. This is just understanding an unmet need. Number two element is your solution. Okay, you might think this should be the easiest, right? You've been working on a technology for many years. My experience is this is what I'm asking, what I mean by this slide is probably the most difficult for most people in the room. Your solution needs to be understandable to a lay or frankly uninterested audience. If you're going to go pitch to an investor at some point or an entrepreneur, they hear pitches like this all the time, and so you have to do things that succinctly describe your technology and grab their interest. It needs to be brief. We have a picture of an elevator here. I've timed the elevator from the bottom of my building, Wickenden, to the top floor. The most allowable time is 43 seconds. Right? If you cannot describe your technology well under that in 15 to 20 seconds, then you've lost your opportunity. It needs to also clearly tie back to that unmet need. So you have to understand why, how this technology starts to solve that problem. Number three element is value proposition. So value proposition kind of answers these two fundamental questions. So what and who cares? Might seem obvious, but if you listen to other people tell you why they think their technology is important, if you ask these questions, a lot of time that doesn't come through. This also ties back to your unmet need. And more than ever, we need to also have an economic value component of your value proposition. So normally when we think about value, we can really simplify that equation. We can say that's your clinical outcome divided by the cost for the treatment of a disease, per se. A lot of technologies that are coming out these days try and do both, reduce the cost and improve the outcome. That's great. I don't think that's always necessary. There are times still when you can increase both the outcome and the cost, but you just need to consider this ratio. To increase the cost, you really need to make a significant improvement in the quality of the outcome so that you have a big delta for your value. The number four element is intellectual property. This is important because at the end of the day, whether you're a company or whether you're trying to license technology out of the university, this is what you're going to be, this is the bulk of what you're going to be selling. All right, so this is usually when we're talking about intellectual property, in this case we're talking about patents. There are other types of intellectual property, but usually we're talking about patents. It's not adequate to have a patent. It must be a valuable patent, which means that it must have broad enough claims to cover your technology. And then the other piece that I typically see mistakes, there's two sides to intellectual property. There's the side that most people focus and our tech transfer office focuses on at the university, which is patentability. That's, can you protect the idea? That means, can you keep other people out of your sandbox? The other side that is equally as important, that is often ignored, is the idea of liability, which is, can you practice your idea? That means, do you have to infringe on somebody else's patent in order to take your technology to market? If so, it could be okay. You might be able to license use of that technology for your company. Very often you'll find that it was competitive, big companies that have that IP, and that poses a big problem. The fifth element is oversimplified. You can think of it as, how much product can you sell at what cost, assuming that you were selling it to every single person that was eligible for this technology. That at least gives you a ballpark number. Core components of a market assessment would be the size of the segment served, and we'll talk about that in a second. You need to know the price and the cost of your solution. So your price is what you're going to sell it for. Your cost is how much it costs you to make it. And in between, there's something called margin, which is relates back to how much profit you could possibly make off the technology. And then you're also concerned here with the dynamics of the market. So some market segments or markets increase over time, some decrease, some stay the same. An example in orthopedics, with the baby boomer generation, there's a huge increase in the number of hip and knee replacements that are expected to come. So that's a dynamic where that segment of the market is increasing at double-digit rates. But you want to know if your market is decreasing or if it's staying the same or increasing. Here's an example very similar to what I hear all the time. Say you have a widget for reducing infection in patients with chronic kidney disease when they undergo peritoneal dialysis. Okay, you've talked to every provider you know, and they would love to buy that widget. They have a problem with infection, and they're always concerned about it. So let's assume that you can sell your widget for 30 bucks, and let's assume that you can make it for 5 bucks, so you have a healthy profit in between. And you find out there's 33 million people in the United States with chronic kidney disease. So you're going to be rich, right? 33 million times 30 bucks is magically $1 billion, right? Almost everything that I hear has $1 billion market the first time I hear about it, right? That is a magic number, okay? Any problems with that assumption? Anyone catch a couple of the issues there? No? All right, well, let's just look at chronic kidney disease. You can segment it right off the top, whether you know you have it or not. So there are 33 million people out there with chronic kidney disease, at least that's what we think, although 30 million of them don't know that they have it, okay? So now you're immediately down to 3 million patients with chronic kidney disease. Do all these patients get peritoneal dialysis? No, not even close, okay? So you can segment this by disease severity, and what you see is that dialysis is really only an option for end-stage renal disease patients. That's the most severe case. That narrows you down to 0.6 million. If you have end-stage renal disease, you really have two options. You can either have a transplant or continue on dialysis. Most people choose dialysis, but still you're losing some numbers for the transplant. And then you figure out that there's two types of dialysis. Your technology only works for peritoneal dialysis, which is only about 50,000 people per year. So you go back and multiply that 54,000 people per year times $30, assuming your $30 number was correct, and now you have a market size of 1.5 million, which is not big enough to do anything. Okay, that's kind of a deal killer for this technology. Okay, number 6 element is competition. So I spent a little bit more time on that market element because that to me is something that is always, it's continuously a problem. Number 6 is competition. We talked about the need to understand what your competition is. This is kind of a standard way that people describe very succinctly who their competition is and how it relates to their technology. So very commonly you'll see along the horizontal axis, you'll have the different competitive technologies. Usually yours is either right on top or right on bottom. And then you'll have the specific traits of the technology. Is it non-invasive? Does it prevent infections? Is it low cost? And then you'll specify, with either checks or X's, or sometimes you make it more quantitative with $3 signs or $1 sign. You show what the differences between your technology and each of the technologies are. People love to see this because it immediately helps them understand who the competitors are and why you're different than them. Usually you always see green check marks for your technology. That's not uncommon across the board. Number 7 element is regulation. So the United States FDA is charged with ensuring safety and efficacy. It's a difficult job. I think they've gotten much better about working with inventors over particularly the last 10 years. There's 3 classes of devices. We could spend, hours talking about the regulatory process, but, very simply, a class 1 device is minimal risk. Think tongue depressor. At the other end of the spectrum is a class 3 device. Think a laser to remove coronary calcium. These are the very high risk, usually they're implantable devices. In the middle, there's something called a class 2 device, which theoretically means medium risk. Usually this means that you have to have a predicate device, which was previously classified as a class 2 device, and your technology has a similar safety profile to that. There's some other, pathways to fit into class 2, but if you just keep in mind these kind of 3 broad classes, and why this is important is a class 1 device to get approval, you just need to write a letter to the FDA and tell them that you're doing what you're doing. There's no approval needed. For a class 3 device, even when we're talking about in the device space, this could easily cost a couple $100 million to bring a product to market. If we're in the class 2 device, it could be in the $10 to $20 million cost range. So that's a huge difference, right? If you think that your product over the course of its life is going to return $500 million in revenue, if you have to chunk off 200 extra because it's a different class device and chop off time off the patents and everything else, that can significantly make it significantly less attractive of an opportunity. One of the most important considerations, this continues to grow in its importance, I'd say, is reimbursement. As you all know, in the United States, most healthcare is paid for by insurance, and CMS is the largest single insurer and really provides direction for all the other insurance companies. And you have to know how your solution fits into existing reimbursement codes. We're still not in a situation, I don't think we're anywhere close to it, where we really have true consumerism in healthcare. When you go to CVS and you're deciding between a couple of different thermometers, you look at what you're going to get and you figure out what it's worth to you and how much you're willing to pay. It's a lot more complex, as you know, in healthcare. And so understanding how your technology fits into that is really important. If, for instance, you have a solution that costs $500 and hospitals get reimbursed $300 for the procedure, the chance of them being willing to take on that technology without getting a new reimbursement code are very low. The number 9 element is your team. So to me, the core team is a clinician. It's a combination of the clinician and the technologist or the scientist that I think has been shown time and time again to be really important. When you're talking about the kind of translational elements, most of the time, neither the clinician nor the scientist have much of a business background. So including somebody on your team with a little bit of that experience is critical. Okay, and the number 10 element is translational target. We talked a little bit about this, but I think this is really important. Translational target to me means understanding the point of technology de-risking where a big company would come in and acquire the technology. Or if you think it's going to go a startup route, an investor would be willing to make a $5 million investment in the technology to say. Might seem easier than it is. Really the only way to understand where you're going is to talk to investors, talk to companies to see what stage of the technology they'd be willing to acquire it. Sometimes when we ask about this, the only way, honestly, is to go out and talk to the company. Sometimes we hear, oh, if you could just show us results on a bench, we're so excited about that market, we would be wanting to look at it. Most of the time these days we hear we want to see it in a small series of patients. Right? But understanding where you need to move the technology to is critical, right? How can you get to that point if you don't even know where the point is? Okay, so let's talk briefly about how we can integrate some of these elements into a traditional research program. Most science is still translated like this, where we have years and lots of money that go into research. And at the end of that, a lot of people come to the translational programs like me, and they want to see if there's a market fit for that. Okay, this is a very inefficient method. If you think about having an NIH project and I'm saying inefficient just from your perspective, not from forget how much money NIH is dumping into some of these projects. But if you're going to spend 10 years of your life working on a project, do you want to have one meeting with a business person and to have that dream squashed in 15 minutes because you didn't look at to see that somebody else has a patent for exactly what you've been working on, or figure out that it's just not a big enough market, or it's just not a big enough jump in value. So this to me is one of the things that drives me crazy, is this approach of, let's work on it from a research perspective for 10 years, and then at the end, let's see what applications we can have of this. And over the course of your career, as you know, you have maybe 30 or 40 years of doing research. This might give you 3 or 4 shots on target. We see normally 1 in 10 companies, somewhere around there, succeed. So what are your chances of actually making an impact if you're going to have 4 tries at that very early stage? So what I like to see is, we're still a research institution, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't do a lot of research and put a lot of time on these technologies. I guess what I'm trying to argue is that some of these other concepts should feed into your research. They don't need to drive the direction of your research necessarily, but you should at least understand the core regulatory concerns that you would have. Which class device are you headed towards? Do you have an opportunity to move from a class 3 device designation to maybe a class 2 device by changing it just a little bit? Have you thought about the market, what your market size is, who you're really focusing on? Have you thought about intellectual property? Not just are you able to get a patent, but how strong is that patent? And are there other patents out there that would prevent your technology from being able to be used? Before a project even starts, you can validate the market size, the segmentation, the unmet needs, competition, and many of these other elements before you even decide working on a project. And it's not difficult. I mean, this can be done in hours. During your project, you can inform your design with, I mentioned, regulatory issues. If you can steer your device to follow a predicate device, that is hugely valuable. If you can steer your technology to generate new IP or not infringe on somebody else's IP, that's also really critical. So one of the things that I often also am asked is, what are some traits of successful innovators, serial innovators? So this is researchers that have made the transition several times and commercialized several technologies. And these are the list. So the science is important, right? All these people are world-class scientists. Most of them have several R01s at a time. They're interested. They're in academia because they like science, but they know that it isn't everything. So they need to understand some of these other components. They can and do communicate with non-scientists. So this takes more, as I mentioned before, this takes more practice than you think. We run a program in collaboration with the state of Ohio, which I'll talk about in a second. It's an I-Corps program. It's amazing how difficult. If you sit down, go home, today and try and talk to somebody that doesn't know about your line of research. It might even be your mother or father or child, and just try and explain to them in 20 seconds what you do, and then have them repeat it back to you, what they think you do. It might be pretty enlightening to see how difficult it is to communicate. We're so in a bubble in academia. You think you're going out and you're talking to people, but you publish in the same journals as your peers. You go to conferences and talk to 100 people that are closer in education and experience and everything to you than they are different. So you really have to try and get out of that bubble. Successful serial innovators spend a lot of time at the beginning of a project trying to identify the problem that's worth solving. They're able to predict a product need 10 plus years out. This is a little bit more difficult, but if you think about you starting a research project today, even if it was going to be a class 2 device, chances are by the time it really was mainstream commercialized, it probably is 10 years from now. So trying to predict where the field is going is an important characteristic. If you're solving a problem that is here today but is not going to be here 10 years from now, that's a problem. And then they seek out a multidisciplinary team because they know what they don't know. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the resources that are available at CASE. A little bit of a baseline, did a little bit of research for this. Our nursing school is in the top 10, which is great, world-class nursing school. We also have a world-class medical school. It's the top 25 in the US. We have the biomedical engineering programs are a little more difficult, but usually considered a top 10 biomedical engineering department. So we have a lot of these really critical research pieces together, and we're right in the middle of a hotbed of top-tier medical providers, world-class medical providers. So we have a lot of things working for us. I'm going to talk a little bit in more detail about the Coulter program than some of the other programs, because that's the program I'm most familiar with, and I think it's the longest tenured program and probably the most significant translational program that we still have at the university. It's a partnership between, well, maybe I talk about this in a moment. The purpose of this partnership was to move technologies from the university to industry where they can impact patient care, which is what we've been talking about this whole time. We've now been around for 13 years. It's often cited as a gold standard program. It's been copied by NIH, by NSF, and by other states. The model has expanded beyond biomedical engineering. I think it's stayed mostly within the engineering fields, but it's outside of medical now. And select programs, including CASE, have endowments from the Coulter Foundation to continue the program in perpetuity. So there's 7 programs that have endowments like this. This is the network of different Coulter programs. It really makes an elite group of particularly biomedical engineering departments around the country. This is a very valuable network. We use it to connect investment opportunities to even we've combined technologies that can be licensed out. We work very well together. It's a great asset for the program. I only have a few more minutes, so I'm not going to go into much detail about our process, but really what it's all about is de-risking. So what you're trying to do is eliminate, in translational research, you're trying to eliminate the potential for the idea not to work as a business opportunity. Often that includes doing some technical research, but always a part of that is understanding some of the business fundamentals. The program is really led by an oversight committee, which is part board of directors, part investment committee. This is composed of non-scientists. It's professional investors, serial entrepreneurs, people from industry that normally acquire academic technology, and then a few clinicians. The chairman of that board is always the BME chair, and that's Bob Kirsch right now. And it has an experienced and dedicated staff. So this is my full-time job. My primary concern is the Coulter program. We have an associate director. A position is being filled right now. And we have a designated person from the tech transfer office for the program. The profile for the project is that it must be a collaborative project between a clinician and an engineer. It must address a commercial interest. It's not to further areas of research interest. The technology must have what we consider near-term licensing potential. So that doesn't mean that we expect that a technology is going to be commercialized and sold within 3 years, but it means that it can be licensed out of the university in that time. It must focus on solving a patient need, and it can really be anything in the medical space, although I will say that most of our investments have been in the medical device, diagnostic, and growing in healthcare IT. We usually at any one time have about 1 therapeutic in it, but that's not really our strength. In terms of impact, over the 12, 13 years now, at least at the turn of the year, we've supported 73 projects with more than $8 million of translational research funding. That's returned more than $140 million in follow-on investment in these companies, most of which was venture capital. It's contributed to 19 startup companies, and that number is probably a few old at this point. About a third of the technologies we bring into the program have been successfully licensed. About a third of them have failed within that first 3 years, which I also think is a success because it helps people move on to the next thing. About a third of them are what worry me, and those are the ones that we still don't know whether they're going to succeed or fail. We have 26 technologies in humans, which is really the reason for this program being around. And one thing that has definitely happened is the culture change has happened, particularly within the biomedical engineering department, towards translation, and then more broadly across the university. Okay, so this is the last slide. I wanted to just put together a list of some translational resources that would be available, particularly for nursing. The Coulter program would love to have more technologies come from nurses. We received one last year for, I think, the first time since I've been here. I'd love to see more. I think that there's 3 basic services that are offered by translational research programs. Funding is a big piece. Support is, what I mean by that is project-specific guidance by mentors and by individuals that have experience in translating technologies. And then the more broad piece is education, and the Culture program provides all three of these. We also are a partner in an NCAI program, which is the National Center for Accelerating Innovations. That's really a cardiovascular or NHLBI domain-specific program. That has funding of up to $75,000, but that requires a one-to-one cost match. It also does have the one-on-one program support. We have a local grant from the state of Ohio. It's administered by the Tech Transfer Office. It's called either TVSF or CTP, depending on who's writing about it. Its funding is $50,000, also requires a cost match. It doesn't provide any support or education. Tech Transfer Office does have some modest funding. That's usually used these days, though, for matching of other grants. They do have some support that you can get from the office itself, no educational components. I-Corps at Ohio is a really, I think, fantastic educational program. We're a major player in that. I think we have half of the technologies for the whole state in the program this year. Most of them, all of them this year came from the Culture program. Also, the medical school has a venture mentoring program that's in the model of the MIT venture mentoring program that provides one-on-one support. So to me, these are the obvious resources. There's some other ones like the CTSC, but that's still a little bit, in flux. I think I don't know if we have the final details about how funding is going to be allocated for pilot projects, and there's probably some others that I missed. But that's it. Thank you for your time.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Fening. I know that Dr. Fening won't be able to join us in the panel, so if there are questions for Steve, I'd like to give you the opportunity to pose those questions. Dr. Weber.
That's for a request. Your slides, I just love how they flow and get you to think about things.
Okay.
Are they available like on a website, or would you be willing to?
Yeah, if you send me an email, I'll send them to
Okay.
you, or I can send them. Whatever. Are all the other slides being shared?
We can share with the permission of the authors, I think.
Yeah,
if you're willing to share yours, you can send them to me and I can disseminate.
Okay. Yeah, I'm fine. Happy to do that.
Thank you so much.
Are there other questions or comments for Dr. Fening before he leaves? Sure.
Thank you, Dr. Finney. I'm hearing both from you, and it's been resonating, that we need to be putting together teams that involve somebody both on the engineering side as well as on the clinical side and on the business side.
Yeah.
Is there anything already going on between the School of Engineering and the Weatherhead that we don't know about and we should be grafting into?
There's not necessarily between Weatherhead and the School of Engineering. There's a lot of programs. What were you going to say? Yeah, that's early on, and I'm not sure how involved really the business school is in that course. So there are programs between the School of Engineering and the School of Medicine in particular. I have to be careful in how I say this, but I think there would be, the best opportunities might be just directly between the School of Nursing and the School of Engineering.
So I have a question for you. You talked about climate change or culture change in terms of the BME biomedical engineering program. What's been some activities that have shifted the culture there that we could possibly embrace here in the School of Nursing?
Yeah, again, when I started, I was in a lab. I had my lab at Cleveland Clinic. It was an orthopedic lab, and I collaborated. This was about, probably 15 years ago when I started. And I would come over across the street to try and collaborate with researchers at Case in the BME department. And the work that was being done was so basic and mechanistic it was frustrating for me at the time. You'd ask people what they were working on, and you understood that they were interested in how cell divided or something happened. The difference today is if you ask anybody what they're working on, they know, even if they're working at the most basic levels, they understand the clinical problem that they're going to be solving and some of the steps that go along the way. It was also, again, going back 15 years, this is not just our department. It was a little bit looked down upon to be working in these translational areas, working with industry. It was almost, if you got industry money, it was almost like dirty money, was not. Now it's a, part of our promotion process. It's a part of our annual review process. Getting money from industry might not bring in as much money as you would get from NIH in terms of indirects, but it really helps to guide the direction of the department and lines of research. And so I think that most of our faculty now are interested in commercialization and technology, and almost all of our recruitments say translational something, this or other. So the department has strategically been directed in that way as well.
Thank you for sharing. Are there any questions, comments from the audience? Well, again, thank you, Dr. Fening.
Yeah, thanks.